Inclusive design for structural engineers. Looking around the room. If I said to you, what do you know about inclusive design for structural engineers? Would you be able to give me any examples? When I look around the room, people are like looking down and trying to avoid eye contact. No, there's a couple. Yeah, there's a hand there. Yep. Absolutely, yep. So it's interesting you start with that one. Okay, I'm going to step it back a little bit and ask you another question. And it's a little bit more interactive, so just sort of on a Friday you can shout, you can put your hand up, stand up, whichever way you want to. But who in their careers so far or at university has heard of the term inclusive design? Oh, there's a few hands. Perfect, that's really good. I'm glad it wasn't all hands because this would make quite an awkward session if you already knew what I was going to be talking about and we'd have to pass the time some other way. But that's great. No, that's good. So there's a few hands that have gone up. So I'm going to be talking the session's for about the next 50, 55 minutes. I've got about 20 slides that I'm going to run through. So there'll be about 15 or 20 minutes of talking. We've got a Q&A session at the end, so I'll be able to pick up any questions. If you do have any burning questions as we go through, I am happy to pick those up. I'm just mindful that we've got the online audience there as well, so just making sure that if any questions come through, we'll pick those up. If there aren't any questions, I've got a question for both of you, so I do encourage you to ask questions, because if not, I've got lots of questions for all of you anyway. So we'll see how it goes. Okay, so first thing is, thank you, Jamie, for the introduction. Why me? Why am I here? Well, I've got two caveats, two things that I should say right at the beginning of this presentation. The first one is that this isn't going to be a magic wand for inclusive design. This isn't intended to be, you follow the presentation, and you'll be able to incorporate inclusive design. You'll be very pleased to hear that it's not about calculations. We're going to be talking about Venn and Moe diagrams. It's going to be a relatively relaxed sort of next 50 minutes or so. But the whole purpose of this is to inspire and empower you to become more inquisitive when you're thinking about inclusive design. So that's the first one. The second one is, my other quick caveat is, I'm a structural engineer. I'm not someone who is particularly sort of trained, or I've got a degree or anything in inclusive design. But I graduated in 1999. I know a lot of you are probably looking surprised at that. It was a long time ago. I became a chartered engineer in 2003, but I've got over 25 years experience in the design of buildings, a whole range of different buildings, everything from education buildings to high-rise to skyscrapers to small beachside facilities. But what I realized is when I started to think about inclusive design, it's actually something that I've been thinking about all through my career, but didn't necessarily have a label on it. So the purpose of me being here today really is to share some of my experiences of inclusive design, to talk a little bit about what the guidance is and, to give you all some examples, but really to empower you to be inquisitive and ask questions. And the whole thing about the sort of guidance that's come out about inclusive design is it's made me realize there's lots of questions through my career that I wish I'd been able to ask. So the purpose of this is to really empower you and make you realize there are lots of questions that you can ask on the projects you're working on, be it buildings, be it infrastructure. And a quick bit about Design ID. I work for a company, Design ID. We're pushing on for 100 strong now. We're civil engineers, structural engineers, and infrastructure engineers. 3 offices, London. We've got one just down the road here in Dublin and Hillsborough in Northern Ireland. For those that are interested, at some point you can scan the QR codes to find out a bit more about Design ID. We're always looking for new people to join us. There's another page for careers there. So that's all I'll say about Design ID. A quick introduction to us and what we're about. Oh, sorry, going the wrong way. So what is inclusive design? It's not just what's on the screen at the moment. The reason why I asked that question at the very start of this presentation is when the question is asked of structural engineers and what does it mean to them as inclusive design, there's a handful of go-tos, a handful of considerations that are sort of thought about right at the beginning. Ramps. Ramps provide access for wheelchair users, for instance. They provide a level access, a way that you can actually get in and out of buildings much easier. Lifts. Lifts are everywhere. Everyone has probably in their buildings or the design that they've done incorporated lifts. Wide staircases, for instance, so staircases that are wide enough to allow people to be able to pass, and things like powered doors and things like that. They are generally the sort of go-to areas of inclusive design that when asked as a structural engineer, the sort of things that come up. But inclusive design is not just about those elements. It's about a lot more than that. There's consideration of things like textured paving, tactile paving. There's about wayfinding for people who are not able to see as well. It's about creating interactive spaces. It's about creating colour. It's about creating a space that will interact with children, for instance. It's also about creating wayfinding. It's also about creating, say, nice external spaces, places that people can go to. They can actually, people have a whole range of different ways that they access a building, they interact with a building. And also for structural engineers, it's about things that we do inside a building, for instance. It's about the grid. It's about ways to bring light into the building. So inclusive design to structural engineers is about a lot more than just ramps and staircases and lifts and big wide corridors. So what I'm going to talk about for the next couple of slides is what inclusive design isn't and then what it is. And the first thing about inclusive design and sort of the way that we end up going down is any project that comes about, more often than not, there's a budget that has been set. And there's something called the building regulations. The building regulations are a legislative set of documents, and the building regulations provide us with our minimum requirements. More often than not, the projects that we work on, they're seen to be a success if they come in under budget or on budget and they meet the requirements of the building regulations. Unfortunately, the building regulations are just that. They're a baseline. They're a minimum standard. They're the first point of call. They're there to create a space, an infrastructure, an environment, a building that meets these minimum requirements. It's to avoid this thing where people can just go off and do their own thing and don't think about too much. So they are a minimum requirement. But inclusive design is much, much more than that. So what inclusive design is about taking the budget, for instance, the money that's available, the cash that's there, the cash plan, the cost plan, for instance. What's interesting about that, though, and I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail and certainly in guidance and things that have been released, is that the cash that's available, the money that's available to develop a building, consider an inclusive design, doesn't always just need to be the money that the client has available. There's lots of other funding alternatives that can be looked at or that can actually supplement the money that is available for the project because that project has considered particular aspects of inclusive design. It's then to start with the building regulations as the baseline, the minimum point, the first point of call. We start at that point. It's not the end goal, it's the starting point. We then have to consider how the building is going to be used, not just now, but in the future. Think about the ways that people will interact, the type of people that will be using that building, the age range of the people that will be using that building. It's then to look at the legislative responsibilities that are associated with different ways that we can access. There's lots of other things other than just the building regulations that we have to adhere to make a building inclusive. It's about adaptability, flexibility, future-proofing. We would have heard that from the point of view of, say, embodied carbon and things like that. It's about not just what the building will do for us now, but what it can do in the future and how it can actually accommodate the change of use over time. And obviously, very importantly, it's about the client's brief. But in inclusive design, it's not just about the client's brief. Sometimes the clients will write a brief, but they don't always understand how the design is going to evolve. So the other side of it is looking at stakeholder engagement, ways that at certain points through the design, we can engage with the stakeholders, with the client, with the end users, and make sure that what we are providing and producing is a building or infrastructure project that is not just fit for purpose for that client's brief, but will accommodate all the different end users. So the iStruct takes inclusive design very seriously. There's a new document that's been released called Inclusive Design for Structural Engineers. Have any of you seen that document or made reference to it? Has anyone in the room seen it at all? No? No? Okay, no, that's interesting. So the document that has been released, the guidance, gives you a storyline, a path, lots and lots of different considerations. Now, the document itself is just under 200 pages long, and you'll be very pleased to hear that I haven't got 200 slides to cover every page, because On every single page of this document is a piece of examples or something that we can follow or something we can bring through in our projects that is just priceless. It's brilliant. So I would highly recommend that you look at this document, get hold of a copy, flick through it, go back to it, highlight it, put sticky notes on it, and just think about the ways that you can bring that document into your own design. This is how seriously the iStructD takes inclusive design for structural engineers. John Nolan, past president of the Institution of Structural Engineers, wrote the foreword for this document. And there was a couple of things that were highlighted in that document that really stuck out to me. Really powerful language that has been used in this document. He says things like, it is morally wrong for buildings and infrastructure to not be accessible, that they are designed to be inaccessible. Morally wrong. That's hugely powerful language and something we need to consider in our projects going forward. He then goes on to talk about, that it can be done for a negligible cost. He goes on to talk about at what stages it needs to be considered. But the last sentence, or one of the sentences he mentions there, is that there is no excuse for not including it as a matter of course. So that is how seriously iStructD takes inclusive design, and that's why we have to consider it in all of our projects going forward. So as you go into the guidance, and I'm not going to flick through 200 pages of guidance, but one of the first opening parts of that guidance is talking about an inclusive design overlay to the REBA plan of work. Is everyone familiar with the REBA plan of work? It talks about stages 0 to 7. It talks about a roadmap, how you develop a project through from its very initial design, from the client's brief, right through to handover. There's lots of other versions or different ways that you can actually go through the design journey. There's probably different ways that have come through from like public procurement through Irish projects, for instance, but they all generally follow the same kind of roadmap. So the RIBA has overlaid what should be considered at what stage. And one of the standout items of that is that inclusive design should be considered at the very outset of the project, right through to the very end of the project. And again, there's some powerful statements that are included in the opening paragraph of the inclusive design overlay. What they talk about there is that it is essential, not even just recommended, it is essential that client design and construction teams should understand and commit to the moral obligations or the considerations of inclusive design and inclusive environments. It goes on to say that it's a misnomer to say that inclusion and incorporating inclusive design concepts is expensive. More often than not, if it's considered at the right time, yes, there might be a very slight cost uplift, but a lot of the time, the cost is far, far outweighed by the benefits. They talk about things like it can minimize change, it can minimize cost increases during the journey as we go through the design process. But what it also talks about is that it can minimize the threat of legal action. So creating inclusive environments also can be backed up by legal requirements as well. It says that the more rigorous and collaborative approach to inclusion must happen. And quite importantly for us as structural engineers, and maybe another misnomer is that we don't really have that much involvement in inclusive design, is that inclusivity is everyone's business. So again, very powerful words in the document and very powerful opening statements as we actually go through the document. As I say, I'm not going to go through the document itself in any detail in this, but I highly recommend you pick up the guidance and you have a read through it. So what is an inclusive design approach? Well, for some of you may have seen this, it's a shearing diagram, and it is a diagram by a renowned architect that talks about buildings aren't actually a thing. Buildings are made up by a series of layers of components with varying lifespans. Now, I'm going to refer to this diagram a little bit differently to that. And the reason for that is that I'm not going to talk about lifespans or anything else, but more often or quite often, those shearing layers can quite often put our consultants and the consultants that are working on projects into silos. It means that we as structural engineers sort of respond to the architect, respond to the MEP, respond to the landscaping, as opposed to considering things all together. I did a presentation a long time ago now, actually, with Alan Jones, former president of the RIBA, and it was around the future of our industry and collaboration for change. And one of the big things that was talked about there is the need for us that if we're going to respond to the way that buildings should be designed and we're going to future-proof our industry, we need to work collaboratively. So an inclusive design approach is about working collaboratively. As I said at the start of the presentation, it's about being inquisitive, asking questions. I am quite an inquisitive engineer. I'm probably not the most inquisitive engineer that you can be, but some may say I'm a bit nosy. I ask questions of other consultants about what they're up to in terms of architects and MEP. But one thing that I have found in my career is that there's no such thing as a silly question. And what I have found also is that if you ask a question of a mechanical, electrical engineer, the landscape architect, they are more than happy to share their experiences, to talk in more detail and explain why they've arrived at the decision they've got to. And it's actually that journey and that decision making and that process which is the areas that we can have the most influence and the most contribution to as well. So an inclusive design approach. Inclusive design is a kind of like the output. The process is about creating partnerships. The SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, talk about lots of different things about how we improve the environment, how we respond to the environment. Ultimately, it's about no poverty. But one of the last goals that's mentioned there, number 17, is partnership for the goals. Some of you may have seen this. Will Arnold, who heads up the environmental group in the IStructD, very nicely put together all of the SDGs into various groups, and all of them are centered around number 17, which is partnership for goals. So again, inclusivity and inclusive design is all about working together. So whilst inclusive design is the end result, I like to think about holistic design being the design process. So from a holistic point of view, it's, the definition of being holistic is characterized by the belief that the parts of something are intimately interconnected and explicable only by reference to the whole. From a medical point of view, which is quite interesting, it talks about characterized by the treatment of the whole person, taking into account mental and social factors rather than just the symptoms of a disease. If we flip that around a little bit and we talk about the treatment of the person being the design of a building, of a piece of infrastructure, of something in the built environment that we interact with, then it is very fair to say that we need to consider all of the mental and social factors that drive that design. And then we need to work together, not to treat the symptoms of a disease, but to create a building or a piece of built environment that is inclusive and interactive for as many people as we can make it. As structural engineers, we talk about, our first consideration is probably the less able, people who need to access buildings via wheelchairs, for instance. They can't access buildings via stairs, they need ramps, they need lifts and those sort of things. But there's a neurological side to inclusivity that needs to be considered as well. There's physical and emotional responses to the design of a building. The first 5 there that you'd probably be quite familiar with is sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. Some people will interact with the built environment, emphasizing more of those aspects of their senses. Some people interact with the built environment when they've had a loss of some of those senses. So what we need to do is make things inclusive to enable people to interact against all of those 5 senses. There's 2 other aspects that are mentioned here as well. Vestibular, which is talking about balance, about rotation and acceleration. Structural movements is probably something that we've all, at some point or another, encountered in our careers, and if you haven't already, you will do. It's to do with vibration of floors, for instance. If you stand on a floor and it starts to move, you perceive that movement. So people will actually be able to, some people like movement, like that sort of acceleration. Some people enjoy fairground rides, some people don't. So we need to create the environment that is inclusive to that as well. And the final one there is proprioception, which is about the positional and spatial orientation. So again, as structural engineers, there are ways that we can interact and create more inclusive design around those areas as well, be it structural grid, about ways that people actually pass through the built environment, the building, the infrastructure that we're designing. So down in the bottom corner there is a little bit of a roadmap. And again, it links into the REBA overlay that I talked about there a little while ago. And that's about feasibility and concept, introduce neurodiversity into the considerations at feasibility and concept stage. The design process, consider the impact of structure on sensory environment and user options. In the bid and construction stage, a big exclamation mark, don't VE out. Don't consider these as luxuries and bolt-ons that if the project that you're working on is over budget, these are the things that can be removed. And I would take it a step further actually and say that within the aspects of inclusive design, we should actually try and find ways to incentivize the bid process, incentivize the tender process, putting targets in place that will encourage the contractors, the people who are coming in to build our projects, to find ways to increase the inclusivity of that project that they're building. And then it goes on to post-occupancy evaluation as well. Now, that's something that as structural engineers, we're not always that good at. We do the design, we get the drawings done, the contractor starts to build it, our structural engineering aspect of it is finished, the frame is in place, foundations there, that's it, we're done, we're finished, this is great. Let the architect get on and look at the external finishes and things like that. It's about going back and evaluating the design. It's about making sure that we're producing really good handover information that allows the building to be used in the future and people to understand how we've designed the building to be used in the future. But it's also about lessons learned. You know, we never get everything perfect all of the time. I far from get everything perfect all of the time. But if we can go back and we can learn from our lesson or the lessons and the things that maybe have gone right and the things that have gone wrong, we can make improvements for the next project that we're working on. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about considerations, and I'm going to talk about really leading into some examples, projects that I've worked on in the past that we have considered aspects of inclusivity. I'm going to go through those for the next 4 or 5 slides, and then the final slide is just going to be talking about any questions, and I'll probably try and pose a couple of questions for you as well. But here's a really good figure. This is a great figure, and it's Verona's Carpenter Architects competition winning proposal for a learning lab school at the University of Louisiana. The reason why I've put this in here is that this section diagram shows a lot of ways in which a structural engineer can create more inclusivity in the building they're designing and interact a lot better with the architect and other members of the design team. The first one there is design for loading to allow plants and their maintenance, including considerations for waterproofing and longevity, and also future use of the building as well. So we would have heard a lot about biodiversity, for instance, but creating things like roof gardens, making sure that we can put planters and things onto the roof of the building. All of this does have to be balanced against, over design and making sure that we're not introducing more embodied carbon into the building. But when you talk about these things early in the design process, it's very easy to incorporate them, low cost and low embodied carbon. Look at planning the roof design to allow for openings for daylighting. So, we don't always get much of a say potentially with the architects about where lights are going to go. But sometimes what we can do is look at our design and actually unlock a vision from the architect to say, you do realize that if I increase the spacing of these roof trusses, if I increase the purlin centers, if I put some trimming in there, I can incorporate a ceiling light, a roof light that will bring more light into the building. So it's about communicating ways that we can remove the limitations to help unlock an architect's vision about how a building might work. The other aspect is considering the sensory impact of exposed structural elements. Something that we have a lot of control on is the structural materials that go into a building. So not just defaulting to steel, concrete, looking at timber, looking at rammed earth, for instance, looking at brick and block, looking at textured surfaces, looking at other materials other than just defaulting to steel and concrete. It's about things like rounded, less sharp edges, for instance, for those that are not able to see as well, creating something where they can follow round. Now, sometimes that is created in the internal finishes, but there are things that we can also do within our column design, for instance. We can round off corners of concrete columns. The contractor might argue that there's a price in that, but if we incorporate it early enough and we put it into the tender documents, that can be included as part of the project going forward. Minimizing internal columns and load-bearing walls to facilitate flexibility. I'm in a little bit of a disagreement with that, because I think that creating big open plan spaces can sometimes increase the embodied carbon in a building more so than the benefits. What I think that is more about is very well placed columns. We can take a lot of inspiration from the commercial sector, for instance. I designed a few commercial buildings in London where it was all about lining the window mullions with the column, with the ceiling grid. The reason for that was that that space could be subdivided in lots of different ways to suit lots of different tenants. So it's not about creating big open plan spaces, but it's putting in place a structural grid that is well considered and allows flexibility in the future. Reducing the depth of perimeter structure can help maximize natural light, absolutely. And it's also about potentially stiffening up the edges of things like slabs, where we can then start to incorporate bigger openings, for instance, or bigger windows and things like that. But the rhythm of exposed structure can contribute to the can't say it. Can contribute to how well a space works. I won't try and say it again. Which can make it more predictable and comfortable. The reason why I've also put this diagram in this presentation as well is that something about inclusive design that I didn't necessarily appreciate at the start, but I've started to think about in the projects that I'm doing, is that inclusive design is not, as I say, a magic wand, that if you do this on a building, it will make it inclusive. It's about creating choice and options for lots of people who have different ways that they want to interact with that building. So what can we do as structural engineers for internal spaces, for instance? This is an example that is in the Inclusive Design Guide for structural engineers. It's one of the examples they give. But I put this up here because it's quite an interesting one that talks about internal spaces. And that is that we can introduce structure, for instance, to be able to support hoists. We can put pattracing in our structure and our structural walls. What I mean by pattracing is things like strong points in the structure to be able to incorporate grab handles. What's interesting about this project is that the grab handles and things like that for people that need extra support are actually movable, can be taken away, they can put in another area. So actually this bathroom and bedroom can respond to the specific needs of whoever the occupant is that's coming into this building. Something that we also think about in Design ID and the buildings that I'm designing is that if we're putting strengthening points in there for pattracing, for things like grab rails and things like that, why don't we make them a bit bigger? And why don't we actually start to use them as the overall structural stability for the building? That's about coming out of our silo as a structural engineer and thinking about things holistically. By doing that, we can actually save money. We can save embodied carbon. So it's about thinking about things in a holistic way. It's another one of our projects at Design ID, but I thought was a really nice project to put up here for a number of different reasons. Fleet Services in England. It's a service station, but a really nice service station. Well, in my view, it's a really nice service station. And that's because the architect had an inspiration for creating a place that was calming. It wasn't just your typical service station. They took a lot of inspiration from around the building. It was in a woodland area. So what we did in that project as the structural engineer is we enabled the woods to come into the building. So all of the structural columns that are supporting that roof are effectively tree trunks, a relatively raw form of timber. And that creates quite a calming effect as well. If you can bring nature into a building, it creates a sense of calm. What we also did is had well-placed columns as well. They're on a grid that can allow flexibility of space. It allowed the roof to span over the columns to incorporate lighting features within the roof itself, create a nice light, airy space. But also at ground level, at the floor level, it created choice. Choice for inclusive design, different ways that people would interact with that space. From a, maybe it's from a retail point of view, it's from a relaxation point of view. People have been driving for a long time. They want a place to actually relax. On the other hand, you've just come out of a car where the kids have been in there for 4-5 hours. They need something to get rid of that pent-up energy. So again, it's creating another space that is inclusive of the children, for instance, that are using this service station. Different forms of seating as well. People will be sitting there to eat. People will be sitting there to relax and keep an eye on the kids that are running around. So in this case, I thought it was a good example of where choice in terms of inclusive design has been incorporated into the building alongside materials that are more natural. Benone Strand Limavady is probably my favourite project that I've ever done, I'd say. I love the beach. I love growing up I grew up on the coast. I love surfing and bodyboarding, all that sort of stuff. The reason why I love this project is because it's something that I think is a definition of inclusive design, about ways that a building can interact with people who are coming in and using that building in different ways. One of the examples that's in the iStructD Inclusive Design Guide is it talks about a beachside facility. It talks about a cafe. And it talks about that cafe incorporating building regulations. It talks about the beach cafe being elevated above the sand, above the beach a little bit. There was a ramp that went up to the cafe that allowed wheelchair users to be able to get into the building. At the top of the ramp was a landing, so a point of rest. At the end of the landing was the door to get into the building. That building was designed and met building regulations. It was not inclusive. The wheelchair user, as they went up the ramp, got to the landing, the door that was at the top of the landing, at the edge of the landing, opened outwards, not inwards, because it's windy on the beach and you don't want the doors blowing in. So the wheelchair user would have to pull the door towards them. To do that, they'd have to ease back a little bit down the ramp, which means one hand is holding the wheelchair in place, the other hand is trying to pull the door open. Because it's windy, the self-closer on the door was set at its stiffest setting. So not only is that person trying to open the door while balanced precariously at the top of a ramp, they're having to pull with a lot of force to get that door open. The ramp wasn't wide enough to allow anyone else to actually come up and be able to help them open the door. It also meant that the wheelchair had to be on its side a little bit. There was a very small threshold to actually get into the cafe. It'd be great if you're going at it directly, but trying to get over that threshold when you're sat in a wheelchair sideways trying to hold open a door. That example, and there's lots more detail that's in the Inclusive Design Guide, and have a read of it, because it's one that, when I'm talking about inclusive design, it's a great example to demonstrate why we need to consider it and why building regulations, just meeting building regulations as the bare minimum, is not enough to create an inclusive space. So this project here at Benone Strand Limavady, we worked very closely with the architect to create a very flat surface. What you'll notice there with the little child on the bike there is that to get into the beach cafe was basically a corridor through the middle of the building. There's a big sliding door on there that you can put up for security. When the building is open, the big sliding door is open and people can get into a sheltered space. Once they're into that sheltered space, they can then get into the cafe, they can get into the toilet and shower facilities without the need for outward opening doors and big stiff self-closers on there. Everything was level. The views out to the very edge of the building, we integrated the structure. We brought the structure up a little bit higher. That's Corten steel sheet piling that also adds as containment and balustrading. But also the seats and everything for people that are using this facility are set back a little bit, which means that people who are in wheelchairs or have less mobility can still get to the edge of the balustrade to get the beautiful views over Benone Strand. So again, I think this is another example of how, as structural engineers, we can unlock a vision for the client by saying, well, we can create you an open corridor space. We can create level thresholds. We can set finished floor levels. We can set structural grids to allow a more open, inclusive, and accessible space. The final example that I've got as a project is our very own office, actually, in 23 Lisbon Road, Hillsborough. And the reason why I talk about this is because as a group of structural, civil and infrastructure engineers, we wrote our brief for this building. It's actually a refurbished motorbike showroom and garage, but we turned it into our own offices, but thought about all the inclusivity that we wanted to bring through into our workspace. Everything is pretty much level threshold. When you come in off the street level, you can come through the front door. Everything is on the one level. Everything is accessible. We've got dual purpose finishes there. So where the architectural finishes also have a dual purpose as controlling noise and vibration, so that you get a reduction in sensory overload for people that are maybe very sensitive to that, people who are sensitive to sound. We create in there a central space where people can break out into and do their work, or they can stay at their desk. We've also got a green room, an area in the building as well, where people can go in and actually, feed their children, or they can just literally just get a little bit more break away from what's going on in the building around them. We've got external space as well that brings colour and it brings texture and different finishes within the building itself as well. So what can you do now? This is my second from last slide. And as structural engineers that are working on projects, what can you do right at the moment? Well, the one thing you can do to contribute to inclusive design is be a sponge. And what I don't mean is live under the sea and have a best friend who's a starfish. What I mean is listen, absorb everything that's going on around you. When you're sat in a design team meeting and the structural engineering has gone from the agenda, listen to what the architect's talking about. Listen to what the landscape is talking about, the MEP, and ask questions. Be inquisitive and try as much as you can to work collaboratively. This is the only time in my entire life that I've been able to compare myself to Einstein. I don't think there is a comparison. But what I will say is, and I said at the start of the presentation, is that I'm not a qualified inclusive designer. But I'm someone who's very inquisitive and likes to ask questions. And as Einstein said, I have no special talents. I'm only passionately curious. And that's one of the things that you can do right now as structural engineers, other than read the design guide for the iStruct-D. But you can also be passionately curious. Okay, so as I said at the start of the presentation, nothing too heavy, no big calculations or anything else. The whole purpose of what I've done is trying to inspire you and empower you to ask questions. And ask questions is what you can do now if you want to. Nothing too taxing though, please.
Yes, we'll start off with a question from the crowd.
First of all, I think that was very interesting. But I suppose the question that I did have is from your own personal experience, because I get the sense that this is very collaborative. How soon do you kind of have interior designers and landscape architects into a project when you're designing, essentially?
Well, the iStruct-D guide mentioned it as well, and again with the Reba overlay as well, is that should happen at the very early stages of the project. So you'll have a lead designer, an architect who's involved in the project. They've probably been engaged by the client. At that stage, we can start asking questions. I think it's one of those things, I think the industry needs to change a little bit, and if we're going to sort of future-proof our industry and we're going to work collaboratively, we do need to try and encourage more of the various disciplines to be engaged much earlier in the design process. I think there's, again, a little bit of a misnomer around, well, we won't get the landscape architect involved just yet because, sure, that's going to be more fee. We don't know what the project's doing. I don't think that's right. I think there's so much value. And the same, from an embodied carbon point of view, the more that we can do early on, in the long run, the more money we can save, the more material we can save, and the better that we can design our buildings. I mean, what I said there is that, we may not get to the best inclusive design, but we can always keep getting better. So if we can learn from our lessons and bring those forward and bring more of the consultants around the table earlier in the design process, that's when there can be the maximum benefit and the more that we can do in the project going forward. Does that sort of answer your question?
I suppose it's more from a commercial sense as well. Like, how soon is it right to kind of have them into a project? But I suppose that kind of answers it, that it's good to kind of have them on board as early as you can?
Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, each project is different, and each architect and MEP and various people who are involved in that project slightly differently. So I think it's a case of if you ask the questions soon enough, then we'll get to either the limitations of that consultant, or more importantly, they can start to identify the specialisms they need to bring into that design. So, if we're talking about landscaping, for instance, as a structural engineer, we don't always just want to respond to landscape design. We want to say, well, there is a way that we can integrate retaining structures in a much softer way, a much more natural way. If we can bring a landscape architect, if we ask the question about, well, how can we deal with this other than just putting in a concrete or steel retaining wall? If we ask the question, it'll tease out the specialism being engaged much earlier on. So I think that's where we can have a lot of benefit. Ask the questions, be inquisitive, and show the areas where if we can bring those specialisms in, we can have much more value and benefit to the project. Oh, yeah.
So got a question saying, how often do you find yourself challenging architects or clients to make the design more inclusive? And again, how often are your design changes accepted and implemented?
I love challenging architects. It's great fun. But I love challenging them from the point of view of in a constructive way. How often do I do it? I like to ask questions of the architects all the time, but not just the architects, all members of the design team as well. Of recent, I suppose, not necessarily from an inclusivity point of view, but challenge the architect on a facade connection back to the structure. Because I felt that, if we thought about it in a slightly different way, there's a way that we could actually slim the concrete down, we could take material out of the building, we could challenge things in a slightly different way. It's not just about challenging architects, though, in terms of going, why have you done this? It's not right. As I say, there are ways that we can actually engage with architects and challenge them to say, you do realise, as a structural engineer, if I move this column a little bit, you can actually put a much bigger window opening through the facade. You can create that roof light. You can create a much more rhythmic structure. What we assume is that when an architect is engaged on a project, that they know the limitations of all the other design team, and they must be coming up with the best solution. And if they haven't, it's just, they just haven't done it right. Quite often, it's just because they don't know. They don't know what's achievable. We had a project for the University of Buckingham, and it was just about, doing cantilevers and things like that. And we actually said, if you do a cantilever, you can make a much better space. And the architect didn't even know that was possible. So it's challenging them in different ways.
Take another question from the crowd.
Yeah, it kind of ties in with the last question. Have you seen a lot of buy-in with regards to inclusive design? I could kind of see that working more so with blue chip clients or government jobs, but for smaller clients who just want to get the quickest, cheapest design out there, have you seen any stumbling blocks in that? Or
the biggest stumbling block is time and getting it considered at the right time. So with some of the smaller clients, sometimes we see that smaller clients won't engage with the full design team early enough in the process because they're trying to save fee or they're trying to save money. And that's what I say, it's not always, I don't think that's commercially quite right. I think, when you consider the cost of fees against the overall cost of a project, by engaging much earlier and getting that expertise in much earlier means that we can actually save money on a project. With smaller clients, I mean, it's all about education to a degree. It's just about asking the questions, keep asking the questions. What we find, if we've got repeat clients and they're smaller clients, their first go at a project, they've learned their own lessons as well. If they re-engage us on a new project, you'll find that maybe their viewpoint has evolved a little bit. They've seen the benefit of doing some things to do with inclusivity much earlier on. But inclusivity is not just about the there and now, but it's about future-proofing the building as well. So there are things that can be done now to actually increase the longevity of the asset, effectively the asset that they're investing in. But it's no project's the same. It's always a challenge, I guess. I don't know any real quick and easy answer to that other than just keep being curious and asking the questions of the client and the design team.
Another question's come in online. Do you think that inclusive design will need to adapt to account for the future? For example, climate change, developments in technology and such?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, yeah, when we're going through design, it's about how we adapt our design approach, not just about how we actually design things as we go. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, you find that things like sea levels are rising. That sometimes we have to increase the height of the finished floor level of a building because we have to incorporate higher sea levels at the risk of flooding and things like that. So inclusive design is going to have to adapt to that, because it means that we're going to have to find ways that you can still access and engage with the building while still, possibly putting some building and infrastructure on stilts and things like that. So 100% is always going to be ever evolving. So it's always one of those design considerations. Don't just think about the here and now, but think about how the building. But engage with the civil engineers as well. I mean, I'm a structural and civil engineer, so I tend to sort of try and talk about both sides of it. But we have to adapt. Have to adapt, definitely.